Right, here we are in the central part of Lancaster, and welcome to the Lancaster Health History Trail. And this has been designed as part of this year's Lancaster Health Festival. And I have to say a couple of thank yous to start with. Firstly to Ian Dewar, Hospital Chaplain and Chief Organiser of the Health Festival, for allowing me to do this filming and put it on the Health Festival website. And a special thanks to Ivan Drozdov, who's the photographer that's done all the hard work of putting this video together. So I'm going to start here at point 1 on the walk, which is at the back of the Story building, and this is at the corner of Castle Park and Castle Hill. And in this location here, there's no building now because it's been demolished, but there was a large house, and we'll show a photo of it. And this house was belonged to Dr. David Campbell. Dr. Campbell was one of the first physicians to work in Lancaster. He was from Poole in Dorset, born in 1749, and he trained in Edinburgh, and for some reason he settled in Lancaster. We're not sure why, but he stayed here and he practiced here and he served the people of Lancaster until he died in his 80s. He's famous for a few things. Firstly, he's notable for establishing the Lancaster Dispensary in 1781, and I'll say a bit more about that later. And he's also important because he was a founding member of the Lancaster Medical Book Club, one of the oldest medical societies in the country and still going, although it has a different name now. And he's also famous for publishing a treatise on typhus, and there was a large epidemic of typhus in the early 1780s, and he treated over 500 people for typhus, and another 180 at a cotton mill at a place called Backbarrow near Newby Bridge. He's also probably the person that purchased the famous Lancaster Codestone, which we'll see towards the end of the trail, which is now on the front of the old part of the Royal Lancaster Infirmary. So we're going to move now up towards the castle, which is just in front of me over there. So we're at the second point of the walk, and we're approaching the front of Lancaster Castle, and behind me you'll see the Ashton Memorial on the hill, which is now Williamson Park, built by Lord Ashton. And then over my left shoulder there is a building with which is got black painting and high windows, and that is the site of the former stained glass manufactory for Shrigley and Hunt. And I understand that Lord Ashton's father actually was an apprentice for Shrigley and Hunt, and we're going to see some examples of the beautiful stained glass work that Shrigley and Hunt made later on when we get to the Royal Infirmary. Okay, we're now a little bit higher up the walkway to the castle. This is Lancaster Castle, which is now reopened again for visitors, and you can do guided tours in the courtyard, which are well worth doing. And Lancaster Castle has been very important for the medical history of Lancaster. It was the site of the county jail for well over 800 years, up till 2011 when it closed as a prison. And it was the place of the first infirmary in Lancaster, which followed some visits by a prison reformer called John Howard in the late 1770s. The infirmary here was just called just 2 small rooms, and there was separate provision for prisoners with mental health problems who were described at that time as unruly lunatics. The Castle surgeon was the first employed role for a medical practitioner in Lancaster, and it was here that a young Lancastrian called Richard Owen was apprenticed to the Castle surgeon's partner, and one of his duties at the time was to undertake post-mortems on any prisoners that died in the castle. And I have been doing some recent research to investigate a notorious story that he actually stole a prisoner's head from the castle following one of those post-mortems, and the head rolled down a street over there called Castle Grove, and we'll go to that shortly. The 1820s was the height of the body snatching period, and Owen was fortunate that he wasn't caught in the act, but a number of body snatchers were put on trial here in Lancaster. In 1828, a surgeon from Warrington and his apprentice called John Davis were put on trial for stealing the body of a young lady from a graveyard in Warrington. The surgeon was acquitted, but the apprentice was found guilty and was fined. And I found out later that it didn't affect his career. He managed to get back and become a surgeon at the dispensary in Warrington. So we're coming now down back from the castle entrance towards the building that was the Castle Dispensary for many years, and you'll see just to the left of it a street called Castle Grove, and it was down there that my research suggests Richard Owen dropped the head. It was a winter's night, and he had to run down that Castle Grove and collect the head, which had rolled into a lady's house, a lady called Widow Tasker, and he took the head and then escaped to the surgery of the surgeon he was working for. The building to the right there, which is now an estate agent, and has a plaque on it. The plaque we'll see shortly, but that was the site of the Lancaster Dispensary after it had been in Dr. Campbell's house for a short period. The Castle Dispensary was in that building from 1785 to about 1833. So for almost 50 years it served the medical needs of the people of Lancaster, particularly those that weren't well off enough to pay for treatment themselves. So this building, now an estate agent, was the site of the Lancaster Dispensary from 1785 to 1833, and Dr. Campbell would have worked here up until about 1805. So this building was the centre of medical activity in Lancaster for almost 50 years, and it was the precursor to all the more recent hospitals. There would be a paid resident apothecary and who could prescribe and dispense medicines, and there were visiting physicians and surgeons who were called in to treat patients as required, and they would not be paid. They had no salary, but they could may get an income from certain activities that they undertook. For somebody to get treatment here, they would need a ticket from a subscriber. The subscribers gave funds each year to help fund the dispensary, and as a reward they were given a certain number of subscribers' tickets, and then they could then give those to whoever required treatment. So if they were a factory owner, for instance, they could give a ticket to one of their factory workers to come and get treatment here. Treatment in that sense was not completely free. We know that operations and birth deliveries took place here. Thomas Howitt Jr., the surgeon we'll meet a bit later on, he was born here. But I don't believe there were actual inpatients. I'm not aware that there were any nurses working here. So I suspect somebody that needed a major operation and some recovery time would have to lodge in a nearby lodging house. We know that the Lancaster Codestone was on the front of this building, and there are some photos of it, and you can see just above the entrance there's a space and an architrave or at least a location where the Codestone was before it moved to other dispensaries, etc. So we're now at point 3 on the history trail, and this building behind me is the Judge's Lodgings Museum, which I'm pleased to say is now open again for visitors, although not today. This building was built in about 1625, and so it is one of the oldest in Lancaster. From the 1630s it housed visiting judges and served that purpose for over 300 years. It is now a museum of childhood and furniture, and well worth a visit. When the judge was sitting at the assize courts, if he replaced his white wig with a black one, it meant he was about to announce the death sentence. And that happened to a part-time surgeon called James Case. He was part-time surgeon and watchmaker, and he was from Prescott. And because that was in Lancashire, he had his court case here. In my opinion, he was wrongly convicted of forging a £1 note and was hanged on the hill near Williamson Park in 1799. He was one of the last 3 convicts to be hanged on the hill before the executions moved inside Lancaster Castle. Those convicts that were sentenced to death would have to walk past the Judge's Lodgings house in chains behind a horse and a cart while the bells pealed in Lancaster. These executions were major public events at the time. We're now going to walk part of the route down Church Street, and that would be part of the route that James Case would have taken to walk up to the gallows. And please take care crossing the main road here. So we're here at the junction between St Leonard's Gate and Rosemary Lane, and if you go to the far end of St Leonard's Gate to the junction with the Bulk Road, that's the location of one of the first hospitals in Lancaster, which was a leprosy hospital called St Leonard's Hospital. This was established around 1190. We know very little about this hospital, but there were a large number of medieval leprosy hospitals, and many were named after St Leonard, who was the patron saint of prisoners and had special powers of healing. This hospital was open for 300 years. Leprosy was a biblical disease, and disease at this time was considered a consequence of sinful behaviour in the Middle Ages. So leprosy hospitals were often run by priories and religious orders, and the main feature of treatment would have been rest and prayer and contemplation. So we're here at the junction of Moor Lane and Friar Street, and you'll see behind me the route up Moor Lane that James Case would have travelled behind his coffin, and one of the last actions that he would have taken would have been to have a final drink with the other two convicts inside the public house there called the Golden Lion. And it's well worth having a refreshment there as you walk around the health history trail, non-alcoholic of course. There are different accounts of what happened to James Case at the execution site, and one stated that he'd taken a smoker's pipe from the public house to go inside his throat to protect him from the noose around his neck, and that he'd moved the noose forward underneath his chin to try and escape being executed. And that had happened with other people in the 18th century. Unfortunately for James, it didn't work, and he was executed in 1799. We're now going to walk up Friar Street. So we're here at number 7 Friar Street, and this was the birthplace of Sir William Turner. There's a plaque on the wall to commemorate that. He was a famous neurosurgeon and professor of anatomy at Edinburgh University. He's perhaps most famous for his anatomy textbook that went through many editions. I think you can still buy it. And also for some anatomical charts that he produced, which were very popular. And these were one of the ways students could learn anatomy apart from dissecting bodies. So we're here at point 7 on the walk, and this is number 2 Dalton Square, and it features one of the more notorious parts of our health history. This was one of 2 GP surgeries on Dalton Square, and the two were quite separate. This building was the surgery for Dr. Buck Ruxton, and he lived here with his wife and housemaid and his children. He was a very popular GP, and he worked single-handedly from this house. In 1935, the dismembered pieces of 2 bodies were discovered in a ravine near Moffat in Scotland. They were wrapped in newspaper and clothing, which gave some clues about where they were from. And using new forensic techniques, the bodies were pieced together and identified as being Mrs. Isabel Ruxton and their housemaid Mary Rogerson. And Dr. Ruxton was subsequently convicted of their murder and was hanged in Manchester. By coincidence, it was another professor of anatomy in Edinburgh, Professor Brash, that helped to convict him. So we're here at the end of Sulyard Street at the junction with Bulk Street, and across behind me is now a large car park, but there was housing in that area in the early part of the 19th century, and it was in the far end of the car park there that there was a house which was in 1815, shortly after the Battle of Waterloo, was rented out for the purposes of Lancaster's first infectious diseases hospital. It had the interesting name of the House of Recovery, and it was set up following a public meeting at which the local doctors felt it would be a good idea to set up this building away from the dispensary and at that time at the outskirts of Lancaster, so for infectious diseases. It was though part of a small estate of other buildings, so maybe the term House of Recovery obscured the fact it was for infectious patients. It had a resident matron nurse called Mrs. Brown, and the doctors from the dispensary would come down and visit the patients. Main treatment at that time would have been rest, copious amounts of wine, and observation. The House of Recovery had another role. It identified houses that needed whitewashing or limewashing, which was thought to help with infection control. Ironically, it was the cholera epidemic of 1831 and 1832 that led to the closure of the House of Recovery. It was realised that it was too small, it only had 5 beds, and that larger premises were needed, and the building here was demolished. We'll see the subsequent building during the rest of the health trail. So we're now back on Dalton Square. We're now at number 8 Dalton Square, and this is the second GP surgery unit in Lancaster that's been on Dalton Square, and this one is still functioning as a GP surgery and is quite a large practice. Its history has been written by John Chippendale, who's a retired GP from Lancaster, and he's asked me to point out that this surgery was not linked to the one run by Dr. Ruxton. So this was started as a solo GP practice by Dr. James Aitken, who was the public vaccinator for Lancaster and also the physician to the workhouse. This building became the practice headquarters in 1929, and at that point there were 3 GPs, Doctors Aitken, Miller and Mowat. So this is the Victoria Memorial in the centre of Dalton Square, and it features a lot of men from the Victorian era, and I think not many women. Florence Nightingale is on here somewhere. 3 important surgeons, Joseph Lister, William Turner and Richard Owen, are on the memorial, and the latter 2 were born here in Lancaster. Yes, the Victorian period was definitely a man's world. The first woman to qualify as a woman in medicine was Elizabeth Garrett Anderson in 1865. So here we are on Thurnham Street, and it was close to here was the site of the birthplace of Richard Owen, probably the most famous surgeon to come from Lancaster. Unfortunately, the building no longer exists, but to mark the spot there is a plaque here which gives a lot more information about Owen, one of our country's most famous anatomists and natural historians, and he coined the term dinosaur. You can now see 6 Thurnham Street, which was the site of the Fernham Street Hospital between 1832 and 1894. The building was purchased in 1832 and was formerly Lord Fauconberg's house. It combined the functions of the former dispensary near the castle and the House of Recovery, so it was called the Lancaster Dispensary and House of Recovery. Infectious cases were admitted through a separate entrance, which I believe was round the side of the building. The hospital had wards, a resident apothecary, and also for the first time a resident house surgeon. The first consultant surgeon was also appointed in 1832 to this building, and that was Christopher Johnson, who was also at that time the Mayor of Lancaster. The first operation in Lancaster under general anaesthetic took place in this building in February 1847, just 2 months after the first one in England, which was also an amputation. The patient, Robert Newby, had white swelling of the knee caused by tuberculous arthritis. An above-knee amputation was performed by Thomas Howitt Jr. and was reported in the local newspaper, the Lancaster Gazette. The operation went well, and Mr. Newby said afterwards that he had felt no pain at all, but that he had heard Mr. Howitt sawing through the bone. The same year, Mr. Howitt also became Mayor of Lancaster. The plaque on the front of the building says Owen House, but I'm not aware of any link between this building and Richard Owen. The plaque is located where the Codestone Plaque would have been positioned. In 1881, the hospital was renamed the Lancaster Infirmary, and this followed the opening of a new infectious disease hospital, the Loonside Hospital near the River Loon. So we're now outside the Royal Lancaster Infirmary, and this original part of the hospital was the A&E department and opened in 1894, and it served as the A&E department until the opening of the Centenary building in 1996. After 1996 it became the oncology unit for many years, and then recently, partly because of the pandemic and the relocations, it has become the orthopaedic outpatient department, treating fractures again, and I'm pleased to say I still work in this building. So now we're outside the main entrance of the Royal Lancaster Infirmary. This main section of the hospital opened in 1896, and there's a photo on the website showing the resident medical officers pictured soon after it was completed. At this time, there were already two other large hospitals in Lancaster. The Royal Albert Hospital for Children had opened some years earlier, a little bit further down Ashton Road. And also on the outskirts of Lancaster, there was the Moore Hospital Asylum and the new annex building as well. So we're now inside the entranceway, and to my right you can see one of the two Shrigley and Hunt stained glass windows, absolutely fantastic work, and to my left is one of the donation and legacy boards, and there's 4 of these in the entranceway, and this hospital was funded by the people of Lancaster, was built to a design by a Lancaster architect, and it served the people of Lancaster and continues to serve the people of Lancaster now. The Codestone Plaque, which is just outside the doorway, looks like real stone, but is not stone. It's a type of ceramic called stoneware, which was made at Eleanor Code's factory in London. I'm going to finish the tour here, so I'd like to thank again Ian Dewar and Ivan Drozdov from the communication department for helping putting this film together.